Welcome to another edition of Disability and You. I am Ganesh Singh and I'll be with you for the next 30 minutes. On this edition, I will be having a discussion with Leshanti Daskon, who is the Deputy Director of the International Foundation of Electoral Systems in Sri Lanka. Leshanti is also a disability rights advocate, and she's been involved in disability advocacy for almost 2 decades. So, Leshanti, welcome to Disability and You.
Yeah. Thank you, Ganesh.
And also welcome to Guyana.
Thank you, Ganesh. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in Guyana and also to be here with you.
Excellent. So tell us how you got involved in disability advocacy.
Yes.
As someone without a disability.
Yes, thank you. So as you know, I do not identify as a person with disability, but I am an attorney at law in Sri Lanka. I have been working on the development sector, specializing mostly on human rights. And then when I was in my late 20s, I met my late husband who lived with a disability. He was a full-time wheelchair user, a lawyer himself, and a disability rights advocate. And this is when I got actually personally introduced to disability, and this is where I developed a passion and an interest on rights of people with disabilities. And since then, and it has been now 5 years since my husband passed away, but what I started with him together, the advocacy and the work on rights of people with disabilities, I have continued and I keep continuing the work.
Excellent. Leshanti, as you said, you do not identify as having a disability. So you're someone without a disability. What's the reaction to you as someone without a disability advocating on behalf of the community of persons with disabilities? What's the reaction like from other persons, well, sorry, not other persons, but persons with disabilities and the wider society?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, Ganesh, because as long as I worked with my husband, as long as he was living and we were working together, we worked as a unit, obviously. And then the question of me not representing disability was not...
It was not an issue.
It was not an issue. But then after he passed, it actually, even for me personally, this became a kind of a dilemma where I was like, do I still have the legitimacy to be involved in disability? Because I do not live with a disability. And then we always advocate for nothing about us without us.
Precisely.
Yes. So then how do I fit in there and how do I do this work? And then when I go and I also have to be careful because as you introduced, I am from Sri Lanka. I'm a Sri Lankan. And in our part of the world, it is very easy for people without disability, people who do not identify as persons with disability, to work on disability, but also take a very patronizing approach towards disability. So I had to be very careful about
It's
this.
no different in Guyana, you know.
Well,
Continue.
yes, it is common in most parts of the
Definitely,
world. Yes,
definitely.
yes. So I think the approach I took, and which I think has not been questioned so far, and for me, I think it's a conscious decision I made, and I'm always conscious about it, is to also highlight the fact that I have the lived experience, partner perspective of disability, and that I have now almost 20 years of working on disability rights as a human rights lawyer, interacting with people with disabilities, but always, when in whatever work we do, I do, and even my organization, International Foundation for Electoral Systems, whatever we do, we always give the prominence and leadership to people with disabilities and their representative organizations.
That is important because, as you correctly said earlier, persons without disabilities who, they mean well,
yes,
but more times than not, they take a patronizing approach.
Yes.
And persons with disabilities are not at the forefront.
Not at all. So it is very important for the likes of us who are working on this and who are actually very committed and passionate, and also our mission is to ensure that people with disabilities are at the forefront. They speak for themselves, and we are only supporting. And I think in the context, I'm globally also, because for IFES I also provide support on disability rights for several IFES's country offices. I would say even in Guyana. This is why I'm here mostly. It's very important that with my legal background and with the experience and with the global expertise I have developed, for me to be the supporting factor, because knowledge of the law and sometimes the structures and policies is not very, very common among people with disabilities and their organizations. And
That is true.
Right? So I've realized that my role is to provide the support and provide the missing link, but not be the face of disability rights.
And I'm pleased that you mentioned knowledge on legislation and so forth is limited within the disability community. And across the developed world, and I've worked with many organizations in the global south that work in the interest of persons with disabilities, because their focus for many decades would have been on service provision. The experience and knowledge in the rights-based approach to disability is lacking.
Yes.
And that's where persons like yourself and IFES comes in. Leshanti, you, as I said, would have worked with your husband and now with IFES, championing the cause of persons with disabilities. What would you consider some of your major achievements in specific to Sri Lanka?
Yeah. So for Sri Lanka, some of the greatest achievements, I must confess, were made when my husband was still living, because he was also a political leader in Sri Lanka. So he supported the development of inclusive cities in Sri Lanka, and part of his electorate he supported towards making the city inclusive, because Sri Lanka has a lot of structural barriers, infrastructural barriers. So those were some of the work that I did with him. And with, in terms of the work that I have been continuing, some of the most, I think, impactful work we have done is working with government institutions in Sri Lanka and ensuring that they take an inclusive approach to policy development, because I have supported the process of developing the National Human Rights Action Plan for Sri Lanka in 2015, and also incorporating disability inclusive policies and practices into the work of institutions like the Election Commission of Sri Lanka and the National Social Services Department and such. And working with people with disabilities, getting them together, having cross-disability representation in the work, and making sure law and policy formation is always contributed to by people with disabilities. Say, for example, we had a process of getting public consultations on the Constitution of Sri Lanka, introducing a new constitution, and we were very successful in getting people with disabilities from across the island representing disabilities across the board to provide recommendations on a constitution that would ensure the protection of rights of people with disabilities. Unfortunately, we haven't proceeded any further yet on the drafting of the Constitution, but the recommendations have been submitted, and then we have also given consultations to the committee on the draft that we've submitted. And also, I do some work with universities in Sri Lanka because we believe it's really important for young people and academics to be involved in disability. I also teach at the Department of Disability Studies in one of the universities, and we have developed curriculum especially focusing on rights of people with disabilities.
Excellent. I want to focus on two things you mentioned. One is the recommendations for the amended constitution.
Yes.
You mentioned that it's still no draft has been published or developed as yet. But do you think, with all the recommendations that would have been put forward by the disability community, that some of it would be included, or it was just done by the policymakers as a token gesture?
The drafting process of the Constitution was not a tokenistic approach. It was a very how can I say, a very honest commitment by the government. And what was very interesting for us, Ganesh, was when we submitted the recommendations, our primary focus was to ensure that the fundamental rights chapter of the Constitution specifically recognizes rights of people with disabilities, because we are convinced that if we are to follow and incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, this is one primary fundamental measure that needs to be taken in Sri Lanka, because just introducing disability rights legislation without the constitutional guarantee is not sufficient.
That is exactly the direction I was heading.
Yes. So what is good? The good news, Ganesh, is that I told you that we had the opportunity of presenting before the committee that was drafting the Constitution. And they actually, after we made the presentation, we, in the sense, a group of people with disabilities, and I was there as the lawyer, when we made the representations, the chairperson of the committee said, out of all the recommendations that they've received, they will definitely be putting forward this aspect of incorporating disability rights into the fundamental rights chapter as one of the most important, crucial changes that need to be in the new constitution. So
that's a significant achievement.
It is a very significant achievement. It's just that because I don't know if you are familiar with the Sri Lankan situation right now, because of the crisis we've been going through for the past year or more, the processes have been halted. But when the processes resume, we are hoping that our recommendations will be taken into consideration.
That's
as
great.
Promised. Yes.
So, based on what you would have said, any disability-specific legislation would be done after the new constitution has been adopted?
Not really, because there is a separate discussion in Sri Lanka on introducing what we call a Rights of Persons with Disabilities Law, an act, that has been in draft form for a long time, for about a decade now, which has also been going back and forth.
But what's hampering the progress?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Ganesh, to look at it, because the hampering of the progress is from several. There are several factors. One is the fact that the authorities are unable to understand why a law is required. And B, when a law is there, there is no purpose of a law that does not have an implementation mechanism. And this implementation mechanism usually is either a commission, an independent commission, or a committee that has the authority and the power to oversee and ensure that the act and the provisions of the act are actually successfully being implemented in the country, because there is a lot to be done in the country. So the conflict is actually on this commission, because the government authorities and disability rights advocates and the organizations of people with disabilities are not able to yet
Decide.
agree on the structure of this commission.
So that's one of the main stumbling blocks
That
for any
is.
progress.
Yes.
What about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? Has Sri Lanka ratified that convention?
Yes, we ratified it several years later in 2016. We did ratify it. So this is why it's also very, because in under the Sri Lankan legal system, just by ratifying the law, the convention does not become law in the country. We have to have enabling legislation enacted in the country. So this is why it's very important for us to have the disability rights law, which enables the provisions of the
Of the
CRP.
convention, yes.
Yes.
Any progress on the signing and ratification of the optional protocol?
To be very honest, Ganesh, we haven't even come to the point of discussing
The
the
optional
optional protocol.
I think most countries are in that position.
Yes.
Leshanti, your achievements are many. What about some of the challenges that you would have encountered trying to push the disability agenda?
Yes. So, Ganesh, I think we can both agree globally. One of the biggest challenges that we encounter as people working on the disability rights space are the attitudes, because we still go back to the charitable approach, the medical approach, and the rights-based approach to disability inclusion is yet a very new phenomena for our communities, for Sri Lanka. Although as a country, we've made progress in many aspects, I think it's also because in our part of the world, we also are based on, our cultures are based on religions such as Buddhism, where we have the concept of karma and its effect, and how disability is seen as not a positive thing, but as a negative thing. Say, for example, impact of bad karma, which is completely a wrong interpretation of Buddhism, but this is how our societies and cultures have formed, and we like to look at disability in a very charitable way, in a very patronizing, charitable way.
I think that's how it's viewed in most developing countries.
In most countries. And this is a huge challenge, because giving people with disabilities the power, empowering them to speak for themselves, to assume their rights, is the biggest challenge. Because as long as you look at disability as something that you need to service oriented, social services oriented, you give some monthly allowance, that's it. This is not going to be inclusive. So that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. But I want to add that as I work more with the younger generation, say the university students or the youth organizations, young people with disabilities, young people without disabilities, I can see a transformation, a slow transformation, because their approach is different to that of, let's say, our generation.
That is a true reflection of what is happening in Guyana too.
Yes.
Where the younger persons with disabilities view disability through the human rights lens and not the charity lens.
Yes.
What about getting the older generation of persons with disabilities in Sri Lanka to change their view of disability and their mindset? I know there are probably persons from the older generation who will subscribe to the human rights approach to disability advocacy,
Yes.
but they're the minority.
Yeah.
What about getting the others to really change their view?
Yeah. Thank you, Ganesh. Yeah. So I must state here that we have very strong, very committed disability rights advocates in Sri Lanka, men and women who are from the older generation, who have been there for a long time, who've dedicated their lifetime to the rights of people with disabilities. So I must really appreciate their work and the work they are continuing to do. But to answer your question, yes, so for the older generations, Ganesh, I think it's very important for, since we are in a media institution now, I think the media also has a huge role to play. The way disability is portrayed
That is so true.
is very, very important, because the more disability is portrayed in the media as something that you need to sympathize for, and as much as you disempower people with disabilities in anything, because in Sri Lanka, say, we have teledramas where we have very disempowering portrayals of disability. So these things just reinstate the existing
So it
norms.
reinforces the whole concept of disability.
So these things need to change. And then I also think, awareness. You need to have a lot of awareness and empowerment, and also for people with disabilities and for people without disabilities. It is very important for them to see what empowerment means and how a person with disabilities can live an independent, empowered life on their own.
And that is why, it's important to have disability portrayed positively
Yes,
all across the board. And the media, as you said,
always.
has a significant role to play.
Yes.
Leshanti, you would have mentioned a lot, we would have gathered a lot on the status of persons with disabilities in Sri Lanka. I want to focus a bit on education. You would have mentioned university. We know education is the building block for the development of any individual. It's the foundation. Are there issues with children with disabilities accessing a meaningful education?
There are huge issues, Ganesh. A lot of issues still in Sri Lanka, because to begin with, again, education infrastructure is not accessible in Sri Lanka. And then our curriculums are not developed in accessible formats. We have not thought of children with disabilities when we developed our curriculums, because also our education environment is very target driven. How we teach, how we our classroom environments, our school environments, very target driven, very competitive, and very ableist, I would say. And if you are, say, for example, a child with disability from a very remote region of Sri Lanka, which also has a lot of geographic barriers, then the chances of that child getting a reasonable education is almost zero. And also, if you are, say, a child who is deaf, access to sign language education is a challenge. And then if you are a child with intellectual disability, the fact that the parents would even consider enrolling the child into the education system is questionable.
And the reflection of the education system in Sri Lanka is no different from other developing countries. Well, most developing countries that I would have visited and, have some first-hand, well, not first-hand, but some knowledge on their education system. What about employment? We know that if the education system is poor, employment would not be, employment of persons with disabilities would not be significant.
Yes.
But are there any programs or schemes to ensure that people with disabilities are employed?
Yes, so one good thing that we have in Sri Lanka is we have, for public service, there's a 3% allocation allowed by a government circular, public administration circular, where 3% of all public service employment should be for people with disabilities. So that is a progressive move. But like you said, because access to education is very limited, people who can take advantage of this circular is very limited. But the private sector in Sri Lanka is doing taking some progressive steps towards this, and making efforts to employ people with disabilities, and also making efforts to provide them reasonable accommodation and introduce concepts such as supported employment initiatives, which I think are very encouraging.
But the government, do they provide any subsidies or waivers to these companies or tax waivers?
No, we do not have that yet. Until the disability rights law is introduced, we do not have that yet.
Leshanti, before we put a wrap on the program, I want you to focus a bit on your work you're doing currently with the International Foundation Electoral System in Sri Lanka,
Yes.
as it relates to persons with disabilities, which we would have already established is your passion,
Yes.
or one of your passions.
Yes. So for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, I'm also working for Sri Lanka and also for our program in Bangladesh, and this is where I work mostly with people with disabilities and their representative organizations. So what we work with, how we work is that we have facilitated the formation of a working group of people with disabilities who can provide electoral support, who can provide support to government institutions, to election management bodies and civil society partners on making processes inclusive. And this is not only for a particular institution, but in general. Say, for example, the constitutional drafting process, law reform, civic engagement, civic education, and democratic engagement of people with disabilities. This is what we are mainly focusing on in Sri Lanka and also in Bangladesh.
Excellent. Leshanti, I want to thank you very much for sharing with the Guyanese public on the work that you're doing in Sri Lanka to promote the rights of persons with disabilities. I'm really happy that you would have portrayed persons without disabilities involvement in disability advocacy positively. Because as you would have said, there's some skepticism, not just within the disability community, but outside of the approach taken by persons without disabilities who are championing the cause of persons living with disabilities. So I want to thank you again, and I trust that you'll continue to promote the rights of persons with disabilities all across the Global South.
Thank you, Ganesh. And I must say that I'm very proud of all your achievements also. And it's an honor for me to meet you and your team and to see the great work you're doing. And as we know, with limited resources in countries like ours. And it's such a pleasure to be here speaking with you.
Excellent. That has brought us to the end of another edition of Disability and You. I want to thank you very much. Goodbye.